Hi, everybody. My name is Kim Porter. I'm the executive director of Be a Part of the Conversation. Thanks for being with us this evening for a really important topic. This is the end of Alcohol Awareness Month. Well, just about. We have the rest of this week. April is Alcohol Awareness Month. So we started off this month talking about underage drinking and how we can help to stem that still persistent activity with young people, that alcohol still is the number one substance consumed by young people. Cannabis is kind of creeping on up, but thankfully with young people, alcohol use is coming down, though. It still is the most used substance by young people, but it is coming down. So that's really good news. But tonight we really want to focus on women, and we have a terrific panel of women with us this evening, appropriately. So thank you so much to the Montgomery County Office of Drug and Alcohol. They have been our community partner for years, and we are so grateful for their support and for helping us to bring these programs to you, wherever you live. You do not have to live in Montgomery County, PA, to be here with us. So glad you're joining. We are recording this program, but we really are grateful that you're here live because we want to hear from you. So please feel free to submit any questions that come up throughout the program. You can use the chat or the Q&A. Don't have to wait until the end. You can plug them in there. And my colleague Judy Hirsch is on. Judy and I will be keeping an eye on any questions that come up, and we'll make sure to address those before the program ends tonight at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You can follow up on this page at conversation.zone/alcohol, and Judy will share some of these links with you in the chat. So let's talk about alcohol and women, our cultural drug of choice. It is so pervasive in our culture. I mean, all the advertising that we've seen forever about how this is healthy, and these are all focused on women. I mean, just the kind of pervasive nature of how normalized this is. And, we can see healthful, active, fun things happening, just looks completely innocuous, and everybody does it. Oh, look at this one. This one just cracks me up. How to smuggle alcohol where it's not supposed to be, in a tampon. Okay, what's not actually a tampon? It looks like a tampon. Anyway, yeah, we'll, by hook or by crook, we'll get alcohol if we want it. Fun. This is something from Etsy that I found, just all the stuff that you can find, again, that kind of glorifies it. Home decor, mommy juice, all of this. So, and by the way, young people are watching, right? So we want to model some really good choices and things like that. So we don't necessarily need to glamorize this quite as much as we have. And this one really kind of blew my mind, the wine pairings with Girl Scout cookies. You can't get much more mainstream than Girl Scout cookies, but this is a little unusual to me. So anyway, I mentioned a little while ago that we have a program coming up on opioids, and we hear so much about it because it is very dangerous. And just talking, you'll see why I'm talking about this in a moment, but I just want to give us some context on this. Opioids are deadly, can be deadly. Can be deadly, especially when used illicitly, especially when somebody has an opioid use disorder. But I just want us to understand that we actually, if you look at 2020 at the data, it's very hard. It takes a long time to get all the solid data, but we're just comparing overdose deaths in 2020 to alcohol-related deaths in 2020. So you can see that this is not necessarily as the mortality isn't as rapid. It can take a lot longer. It can take years and years of misery and broken relationships and lost careers and all sorts of things that can go wrong. But we actually lose more people to alcohol-related disease than we do even to opioid overdose deaths. So this is not something that we should be taking lightly. And there's a spectrum of substance use. So I'm going to show you some criteria for helping to identify whether or not we have an alcohol use disorder. But just as kind of the definition, it's basically like so many other substance use disorders, continued use despite negative consequences. So adverse social, occupational, or health consequences happen. DUIs, crashed cars, as I said, relationships even falling apart, things like that, incarceration, all sorts of things, and yet continue to use alcohol. So that is a very rudimentary explanation of what an alcohol use disorder might look like. We certainly can have lots of evidence to show us that the earlier someone starts using alcohol, again, like other substances, the more likely we are to have an alcohol problem with alcohol as we mature. So 5 times more likely if we start drinking before we're 18. And I'm anxious to hear from our speaker tonight, who's going to talk about her story. But so many of the folks who we've heard from over the years will say that they started using their substance very early, looking just for a way to feel normal, to feel right in their body, and to feel it, and they loved the feeling, or they didn't even like the taste, but they loved what came with it, the feeling, the escape, and so forth. So when we start really young, boy, that really does load the deck not in our favor. Family history plays a huge role. So roughly 60% of our risk potential for developing an alcohol use disorder is genetic. So taking a look at that family tree and to see if there might be some risk there. And then mental health conditions. So if we have, whether it's diagnosed or not, if we're struggling with depression, anxiety, other kinds of, certainly trauma is a big risk factor. So these are things that can contribute to the development of an alcohol use disorder. And just taking a look at where we can see, sorry, let me get my glasses on so I can see exactly what I'm saying. All right, so just to give you, this is from 2019, but over their lifetimes, those 18 and older, roughly 85.6% of us tried alcohol. But if you look at past month, which is obviously going to represent a bit more of a regular use, roughly 54.9% of those of us 18 and older. This is obviously not the legal drinking age, but this is just what the study was revealing, was looking at 18 years and older, how many people drank in the past 30 days of that study. And what is a drink? So we can see, like over here on the left, we have what constitutes light drinking, moderate drinking, and then here are the quantities. So an average or a standard drink is beer, 12 ounces, 5 ounces of wine, or 1.5 ounces of liquor. But you can see that, well, actually, I think this is what's very interesting, is that 33.7% of us did not drink in the past year. 45.7% of us drank light, which is less than or equal to 3 drinks a week. Moderate was about 15%, and heavy drinking was at about 5.1%. Again, this is looking at adults, meaning 18 and older. And the Jelinek curve has been around for a long time, and I think it's relevant. I usually only bring it up when we're talking about alcohol, because I think that progression is especially important to talk about with alcohol, because it is legal if you're over 21. It is, as I was just saying, very not only validated in our country, but glorified and considered to be almost essential to sporting events, celebrations, holidays, all of that sort of thing. And it's just so much a part of our culture that it's very hard to see where that progression kicks in and becomes problematic. So like, when do we get to that crucial or chronic phase? And what does bottom look like? And, we can rationalize this in a lot of ways, but I think that's kind of the insidious nature of alcohol in particular, is that progression. And that somebody could be consuming alcohol moderately for many, many years, but then when there's some life happening, whether it's a trauma or it's feeling really discontented in a relationship or a job or whatever that might be, or if something really, really negative happens in our life, alcohol is right there. It's something that we've been using, and it can be very tricky as we kind of like move into that problematic, that crucial or chronic phase. And we do have this on that follow-up page, the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that helps to understand what is the criteria for alcohol use disorder. So you'll find this on we're not going to run through it now, but you can find this on that follow-up page, just to do a little, assessment to see whether it's for yourself or a loved one, to see if this might be something that is problematic. There was a study that just came out at the very end of March this year, that shows, and many of you might remember that there was a couple of things came out maybe in the 1990s or so that said some certain kinds of red wine, when consumed in moderation, might be good for the heart or reduce certain cancers or something like that. But that's pretty much been kind of refuted in a lot of ways. So drinking a glass of wine, from what this article talked about, will not necessarily help you live longer. This new analysis of alcohol research kind of debunked some of those beliefs about even moderate drinking. It looked over 100 different studies. It was a meta-analysis with nearly 5 million participants combined in the analysis they did, and just found no significant health benefit to moderate alcohol consumption, but also did find that drinking a daily serving of less than 1 ounce for women and around 1.5 ounces for men increased the risk of death. So what are some of the ways that that can happen? Alcohol affects us in many ways, actually interferes with our brain function, our communication skills, that can disrupt our mood, making it harder to think clearly, coordinate. Obviously, that's not a surprise, I'm sure, to anyone with a coordination. But our heart, even cardiomyopathy, irregular heartbeat, stroke, high blood pressure, and so on. Certainly the liver, that's probably most known to people, that, cirrhosis, obviously, and hepatitis. Also the pancreas, pancreatitis. We've had a young woman who spoke in the past with us who, under the age of, I think she was around 25 or 26 years old when she found recovery, but was really what prompted her to really take some serious action toward finding recovery, was that she was told that if she continued to drink, she would die. Whether it was just the pancreas and liver, I don't remember exactly, but her body, her organs were shutting down from the alcohol consumption. So it can affect so many aspects of our well-being. It can increase our risk of certain types of cancer, including head and neck, esophageal, liver, breast, and colorectal. Also impacts our immune system. And, we've all been thinking about our immune system in the last 3 years a whole lot more, and that's not something that we want to compromise either. Since we're talking about women, we should also think about our hormones. So it can really impact women's hormone in relation to mood, libido, sexual activity, and impacting menstrual cycles as well. There are many other conditions also that alcohol can impact. But we can also take some comfort in knowing that if we start having some of these problems and we stop consuming alcohol, we can recover. The body can heal and things can start doing better. What happens? Better looking skin, improved sleep, healthier weight, better mental health, improved immunity, enhanced nutrition, lower risk of cancer, reduced cardiovascular risk, and better memory and thinking, which I think we all would like more improved memory and thinking. Again, with focus on women, we need to talk about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. So FASDs are a group of conditions that can occur to anyone exposed to alcohol before birth, so the child that we might be carrying. So these effects can include physical problems and problems with behavior and learning. You can search online for lots and lots more information about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. But basically, we know from some research that about 14% of pregnant people have reported drinking in the past 30 days, and 5% of pregnant people, sorry for the lack of space in there, reported binge drinking in the past 30 days. So not the way we want things to be going. We really want to make sure that we're educating women about, if they're possibly pregnant, trying to get pregnant, maybe pregnant. This is definitely something to be very wary of. There are thankfully some really great opportunities for treatment if someone has been diagnosed with alcohol use disorder. So there are medications that, such as a camprosate, which is the brand name Campril. Also, disulfiram is the brand name Antabuse. So these are some medications that can help with craving. They're non-addictive. We could certainly combine this with mutual aid supports, such as Alcoholics Anonymous and other kinds of programs, Smart Recovery, Recovery Dharma, certainly talk therapy. We're going to have a really terrific therapist that we're going to hear from, Karen Moser, in just a little bit. So we can absolutely benefit quite a lot from getting at the root of what's really happening with our problematic drinking. We also, as I mentioned, have mutual aid groups. So 12-step, it's a buck in a basket, basically. There's so many people have benefited since 1935, I believe. This is the gold standard for a lot of folks. And so we are so grateful that they still are around. Many of them moved into the Zoom world when COVID happened, but a lot of them are obviously back in person now. But it just helps so much to be with peers who understand what we're going through. And it's just an added layer. We have lots and lots of resources, and there's, of course, inpatient treatment, if I didn't mention that as well. But these mutual aid groups can be just a great layer to add on to whatever that treatment looks like. It's always important to take note, though, that alcohol use disorder, when somebody is using very heavily, if they stop using, as they say, cold turkey, or completely stop without medical assistance, this can be actually quite deadly. So while we often hear or might think about detoxing from a drug like heroin or other opioids, that's an incredibly uncomfortable process, that we might know about that. I think that's really dangerous. It's actually not nearly as dangerous as detoxing from alcohol and the other drug. It would be benzodiazepines. So alcohol and benzodiazepines are the two most deadly drugs to detox from without medical assistance. So it's really important to get medical care if somebody has really crossed over into heavy alcohol use and wants to stop. So COVID really changed quite a bit for our culture. Obviously, I don't have to tell anybody that. We all lived through it. But it has actually seen an increase in alcohol use across the board. And of course, there was all this that we saw online. We were making jokes about being isolated. And these are just some things that we grabbed from social media, and again, kids are seeing this stuff. It's cute, but not so funny. And you can see again across the board that drinking increased by 60% once the shutdown, the isolation all started in 2020. 27% people didn't change the way they drink, and actually almost 13% decreased their alcohol consumption during that time, but the majority definitely increased their drinking. This was a Journal of American Medical Association study that took a look at COVID's impact on alcohol use, and it increased by 14% overall, according to this study. But everything down in this gray area relates specifically to women. So women increased their consumption even more. That's by 17%. Heavy drinking increased by 41%, and the incidence of alcohol-related problems among women increased by 39%. So just really want to be aware of this and be thoughtful about the women in our lives that we might be concerned about. Who knows what's really behind it? I'm sure we can all hypothesize on a variety of things, but some felt that, because this was a really challenging time, stressful. And, I feel not to gender norm here, but I think that women do bear a lot of, feel the weight of a lot of responsibility of, kids in school. I'm trying to work from home. I'm juggling a lot of things. So maybe this is just a way to escape, right? Or it could have been that they were feeling like, I'm missing out on so much social stuff. I want to kind of recreate this feeling of being celebratory, or feeling like it's a fun thing to do. And so who knows exactly why this is, but this was all part of this study, some of the considerations that were made. And let's just say too, that it's not necessarily even, we can talk about harm reduction. If somebody's feeling like, I don't think I haven't met all the criteria for alcohol use disorder, but I'm feeling like I'm just overdoing it. So maybe I can moderate, maybe I can cut back. So there are a lot of sober curious activities and books that are out there now, and apps and ways to either cut back or abstain or take a break for a while and see how we're feeling about that, and see where it goes from there. So that is all that I have. So thank you so much for allowing me to share that with you. And I'm going to turn it over to Karen Moser now. Thanks so much, Karen.
Thanks, Kim. Great presentation.
Oh, thanks.
I'm just going to share my screen. Hold on a second. So my name is Karen Moser. I'm a therapist locally, have an office in Exton, and own the Healing Collective, and work with a lot of people who have addictions and alcohol use disorder, and also teach substance use disorder classes at a local college. And what you said, Kim, about how the alcohol use has increased during COVID is really striking, and especially with women. So just get the presentation up here. Okay, can you see it? Great.
Yes.
Okay.
You want to go to just kick in the slideshow. So we're seeing your sidebar too. So
okay.
There you go, slideshow. Yeah.
Thank you.
You got it.
All right. It's been a while since I've done this slideshow business. Okay. So Kim, you did a great job on talking about all the risk factors and everything. And, I just think, sometimes I always wonder what comes first, the chicken or the egg, because alcohol use disorder causes depression, anxiety, and low self-worth, and has people escaping to self-medicate. But then we also wonder, what comes first. And often as we work with people to deal with the issue, we start to get a handle on all this stuff. But it is important to understand that there is a reciprocal relationship between depression and anxiety, low self-worth, because we call alcohol liquid depression, right? So when you consume alcohol, you get depressed, but then you also might be self-medicating some mental health issues as well. I'm not going to go through all of the medical risks because you did a great job with that. But I am going to comment on the Madonna effect. So just thinking about how there's a lot, women have a hard time. If you develop an alcohol problem and you're a mom, how do you tell somebody about that, right? Because there's a lot of shame. Like, it's almost like women, you want to be this perfect mom, this perfect person in the world, and not be impacting your family. And I think sometimes, it's easier for, I'm generalizing, way overgeneralizing here, but I think it may be easier for a man to reach out and get help, even though there might be some shame about it. But women tend to drink in secret. We often find that when women develop a problem, it is more of an at-home issue, that happens after you put the kids to bed, or, under other life circumstances that are stressful, like having elderly parents or things like that, that may impact women having more role responsibilities and maybe feeling more isolated themselves, and then drinking more as a result. I mean, there's so many different ways that this plays out, but the shame, I think, that women carry about it causes a lot more isolation. So the question is, if there's a problem, what do you do? This is not an easy question to answer, because alcohol is our legal drug, isn't it? So, there's, the person who has a problem with alcohol may be reticent to come forward and say, I have a drinking problem, because maybe, I go to social events where everybody is consuming alcohol, and I don't want to be the one who is seen as the person with the problem, and there's, I think, a tendency to hide that and to sort of downplay the problem because of the social stigma related to having a drinking problem, especially because it's so out there in all of our social environments. Although the statistic about how many people's drinking got decreased during COVID was interesting to me. And, I always work with my clients, and, once they stop drinking, to look around and see how many people don't drink. There's a lot of people who don't drink, but the people who have alcohol problems are always, it's gonna be a problem for me to go out there to a party and not be the one who's drinking and think they're gonna have some stigma about that. So first is get help with the diagnosis. You want to look at what's the pattern of drinking, and that the questionnaire that Kim, you guys have in the resources will be really helpful to take the questions and ask, and really answer them honestly. But one of the things that I think happens is, sometimes we look in the mirror and say, hey, I realize I've been drinking too much, and I want to deal with the problem. And that usually happens in very small, it's not something that, people think that someone goes to treatment because they think they have a problem. Usually it happens because there's some kind of consequence that gets people there. Like it might be family members saying they have a concern, or let's say if it's a mom, maybe, having been drunk in front of family members at a party. I have a woman who, that was her bottom. She, got drunk and fell down the stairs at a Christmas party, and she had enormous shame about it, and decided to go get help in rehab, and that was not her bottom. She didn't get sober after that because she was mortified at going to the rehab, and she wasn't really ready. But she entered into some therapy and started to examine what was actually happening during the worst part of her of becoming an alcoholic. And what she realized is she had anxiety for her whole lifetime, and that she had been self-medicating with alcohol the whole time, but had not been aware of it until that moment when she had this incident at the party. She had increased in distress. She had increased stress in her life. She had a lot of other stressors going on, but she hadn't identified alcohol as the source of stress. So that's oftentimes what happens with people when they have an event that causes a consequence that they have to take a look at. So there's a lot of different forms of drinking. Kim, you've already mentioned them: binge drinking versus, episodic drinking versus everyday drinking. And typically what we find is that people start drinking, and I'm also a person in long-term recovery, and I started drinking when I was a teenager, and it was just available, and we just did it. It wasn't like I was self-medicating for sure, but the progression didn't happen until later. For some people, the progression happens very quickly, and for women, it happens more quickly than men because of how our bodies metabolize alcohol. And that's one thing that, you didn't talk about, Kim, but women will develop an alcohol problem in a shorter period of time with less alcohol. And it's a phenomena that's called telescoping. And so one of the things with women is that you could have someone who maybe had a very binge pattern of drinking, or was drinking at social events, and then has, one of the typical presentations is you'll see someone have like like the client I talked about earlier, a huge stress-related set of incidences, and they start drinking more. And COVID was a big one for that. So a lot of people, because of the isolation and not having as much to do, and maybe being more withdrawn from the world, started drinking as a result of medicating some of the trauma, because a lot of us went through trauma during COVID. We lost a lot of family members, and it was a lot of uncertainty in our culture, and that had a huge impact on many people. And so, when you have an event like that and you start drinking, and because women metabolize it differently, and there's a larger amount of alcohol available in the body, that makes people less aware of how it's progressing. And before you know it, you're drinking at a pattern that you hadn't anticipated, and then the consequences start to mount up. And that's where we see this part between substance abuse and dependence is sometimes like a tricky line. Binge drinkers can be dependent on alcohol, even though they haven't identified it as a dependency. You could drink 5 days a week, but have an anticipatory looking forward to it, for all 5 days. You might not maybe need medical withdrawal, but you're so psychologically addicted to it. And then at some point you cross the line into daily drinking, and people that I've worked with will, start have a binge pattern, and then seemingly like all of a sudden they start daily drinking, and then drinking in the morning, and then before you know it, they're drinking all day long. And what people don't know that that's happening over the period of time, and that's really the hardest part. So really, in my line of work, we think about, how do we talk about this? Because the hardest thing that you do, when most of the time when somebody has a problem, other people have noticed it before the individual who has the problem. And so one of the things that we want to begin to do is to think about, how am I going to talk to you about this? And my suggestion is to express concern, make some observations about why you're concerned, what you noticed, and do that as close to an incident that you have with your loved one as possible. Because if you wait 2 weeks from now, everybody's forgotten about it. But if you can, find a way to talk about with the individual who you're concerned about, and not shaming or blaming them for anything that happened. If you're angry or disappointed or frustrated, try not to judge the person. Remember that alcohol use disorder is something that people don't want to have. Nobody rolls out of bed and thinks, I'm going to have a drinking problem. I'm going to make that okay for myself. I mean, most people don't plan to have a problem, and there's family history, and maybe even decided they weren't going to be like a family member who they knew that had an alcohol problem or a drug problem, and then ended up with a lifetime history. Sometimes when we take that sip, we activate something that is going to start progressing, maybe slowly at the beginning, so it doesn't look like what we were dealing with as a family. But again, people don't plan to develop a problem. And so what we want to do is use I statements and discuss what it feels like to be you in this situation, just saying, like, I was with you at this party, using my client as the example. I was with you at a party, and I noticed you were having a problem walking, and it was really scary for me. And I watched, you had a few more drinks than I think you normally have. Can you take a look at this? And so that's expressing concern in a way that is focused on you being concerned, making an observation that's very specific. So because our people who have a problem with alcohol don't have a video camera to see what it looks like. They're in their own bodies, and the way that substance use disorder that plays out is that the person who has the problem can't remember what you as family members can't forget. So, oftentimes, even if the person's not in a blackout, they're not aware of what it looks like. They think they're functioning fine. So, and then timing's important. Do it as close to the issue as you can. Or if you've seen a series of events that you're concerned about, try to lay them out with the person, and maybe do it with a couple of people. And again, you don't want to overload the person and make them feel ashamed, but it's more just expressing concern. And treatment options, when in doubt, seek help. And there's all kinds of help available. There's formal outpatient programs, there's formal inpatient programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, and, Sober Curious, Women in Recovery, Celebrate Recovery. And then you can always encourage your loved one to go to an individual therapist. A lot of us who are trained, not everybody's trained to work with substance use issues. So you want to look for someone who is trained to deal with substance use issues. But most of us out there who do individual therapy with people who have substance use problems are adept at helping people tease out, do I have a problem or not, and really just have a conversation about it, So they can even come to a couple of sessions after taking a test and answering questions on their own to get some help with that. And sometimes what we'll do is we'll follow people over a period of time and help them to make bottom lines for, okay, so I'm agreeing not to drink for a period of time, and what does that look like? You know, can I not drink? Can I not drink without like by my alone? Or, you know, they make what we call it's harm reduction, but you know, in a way that is very strategic. So you look at the problem that the person's having and you help them develop strategic solutions for understanding the nature of their issue, right? So because when a person with a substance use problem is looking at themselves, they're going to say, you know, it hasn't been a problem for that long, and it was only a problem at this time, and is likely to minimize and deny it. And so we help that to be a more honest conversation with themselves. And outpatient treatment programs are for people who have already identified that they have a problem and maybe aren't drinking every day. Maybe they have a binge pattern and going to a group therapy program, they do an intake first to make sure that that person's appropriate. And then there are groups where you can be with people who also have a problem, and it makes it, you know, feel a little bit easier to discuss it. And then certainly if somebody's drinking every day, they probably need to be in inpatient treatment because, as you mentioned, Kim, you know, the risk of, you know, withdrawal is a dangerous thing. So for alcoholics who are daily drinkers. And then, you know, sometimes if people are curious about whether or not they have a problem, we'll ask people to go to an AA meeting or Celebrate Recovery meeting or a Sober Curious meeting or Women in Recovery, just sit in a room with people who have a problem and say, is this me, right? Have them go to, we always say 6 meetings and try to see if it's for you. The other things that are important to think about when you're approaching this issue with people that you care about is sometimes people who have a problem will agree with you, but then not really accept that they have a problem. And so they're wrestling with it. And sometimes, you know, somebody will say, yeah, you're right, that was a terrible situation and I drank too much. And then the next week you'll see them drinking too much again. And you're like, wait, I thought we had an agreement about this. But that doesn't mean that the person has accepted that they have a problem. There's a lot of layers that people go through as they're identifying their problem. There's a lot of ambivalence about having an issue with alcoholism. There's a lot of internalized stigma about it. So most of the time I want to be in control and I don't want to admit that I have to have help to stop. You know, and a lot of people have a lot of pride about that and shame. So, and then the social stigma. So if there is, you know, if you're in an environment where there's a lot of drinking, like a lot of people, you know, have, you know, ambiances where they tend to drink together and that's part of their social group. And so there's this perception of I won't be accepted if I have a problem. And the majority of, you know, we're much more accepting in our culture about this issue now. So this is something that I think, you know, we have to help people get through, you know, because most of the time we would rather have someone alive and well than, you know, consuming too much alcohol and putting themselves at risk, you know, even among the people who are heavy drinkers. And then the word alcoholic tends to trigger people. We try not to use it as much when we treat people these days because we don't want to trigger people to have this conjured up. You know, it's still like, I think there's still like this idea that, you know, the alcoholic is the person who's in Skid Row, who's drinking out of a paper bag. I mean, that is so not the people that we treat in our field. You know, I've treated lots of different populations, but I can say that, you know, alcoholism is you and me and everybody. It's everywhere. And it looks different in every person that has it. And so it's a little bit more confusing to kind of get a grip on what it is. And everybody has a different pattern of drinking. But those of us who are trained to suss that out, we can sort of get a sense of, looking at all of the lifestyle factors that are included. We have to consider, how long it's been happening and what areas of the person's life are being impacted. And those are all the things we consider. And then losing the privilege to drink socially is something that people have a really hard time with. But those of us who have decided to embrace abstinence, because usually what people do is they embrace abstinence after they've tried everything else. That they've tried to drink socially, they've tried to, there was a woman years ago who started this moderate recovery movement, and she actually renounced everything that she said because she, there was like these counting drinks, and which is exhausting for people. And the researchers have shown over time that most people will embrace abstinence after trying moderate drinking if there is a substance use problem, if there's an alcohol problem, because it's just too hard to manage it. And I think that's it for me. I know we have questions, so we'll get to them.
That was great, Karen. That was really helpful. Thank you so much. I love what you said about agreement is not acceptance. I never really thought about it in those terms before, but my dad is not a woman, obviously, but I mean, he's a person in recovery from alcohol use disorder. But I was there. I was that person not using the I statements initially, like begging, pleading. I'm worried about you. Of course, guess what he said? Don't worry about me. I'm fine. You're blown out of proportion. Everybody, but it was when I got some coaching from his therapist, when he was kind of forced into treatment because of some DUIs and things, that his therapist taught me how to say, like, what did she, I was telling her how it felt to me when I would call, because I was living 300 miles away from home. I was an adult by this time. And I would hear him pick up the phone, and I immediately knew when he was intoxicated. And she's like, that's what he needs to hear. What did that feel like when you heard his voice on the phone? He couldn't refute that. He could refute my worries about his health. He couldn't say anything about how I felt about his drinking. So that was beautiful. Yeah. I love that way, the way you phrased that was great.
Yeah.
Wow. Beautiful presentation. So Sarah, thank you so much again for being here. I'm really grateful that you're with us. So jump right in.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kim, for asking me to come. And Karen, you guys did such wonderful presentations. And so I'll just tell a little bit about my story, because I am a person in long-term recovery. And so my basic background, I guess you could say, oh my gosh, I feel like I have so many things to say, and I'll try to talk quickly, but I come from a really wonderful family, really loving family. My parents are divorced, and alcoholism is all over my family. So I definitely have a long, strong genetic component. But even though there was a lot of alcoholism and heavy drinking, there wasn't a lot of chaos either. So my parents divorced when I was very, very young, mostly because of my dad's drinking, and so I didn't live with my dad. So while my dad continued to drink until I was like 11, I feel like it wasn't a big part of my life because I only saw him on weekends. And I think that, when I look back and I say, well, why did I start drinking and doing drugs? I did a lot of drugs too. That's part of my story. But I feel like it was more out of curiosity. I wanted to, feel altered, and a lot of peer pressure and wanting to be socially accepted. And I can say that when I drank, I'll say this, I didn't drink for a few years because I was worried that I was going to be an alcoholic, because I knew that my dad had a drinking problem. And by then my dad had stopped drinking. He wasn't in recovery, but he had become abstinent. And so I did a lot of other things before I drank alcohol. When I finally drank alcohol, I thought, well, what the heck was I waiting for? Like, this is the greatest thing ever. And I immediately got drunk, and then I continued to get drunk, and I binge drank from the minute I started drinking. I drank heavily and as much as I could to get as drunk as I could. And I drank whatever I could. And it's a very after school special kind of story, like girl comes from all the love and opportunity in the world, and I started hanging out with the wrong crowd, and I'm getting messed up on weekends, and that, it's the progression. It's exactly the progression. It was supposed to be a party, and it was supposed to be fun. And then, start having consequences. Um, I I felt this, it was for me, it was a lot about like feelings too. So I definitely struggled with depression very much during my active drinking. So when we talk about like which came first for me, I'm not exactly sure. I think for me that drinking might have come first, honestly. So I became really depressed, and also I feel like there was a trigger that went off in my brain that made me want to feel altered as much as I possibly could. And so I spent a lot of time and energy and money doing that. And there was a lot of math involved, a lot of hours and timing and all of this stuff. And I was really young when I got sober. I got sober when I was 17 years old. So I was a senior in high school. And so some would say, oh, well, like, how could you even be an alcoholic if you were that young, when you got sober? But I kind of think of it like it must have gotten pretty bad pretty fast if I got sober that young. And that is kind of what happened. Like I said, it's like an after school special. I went from partying with friends to like not having any friends. People would say, why do you have to drink like that? And like, we're not, doing it like that. And why can't you just slow down and lay off the hard stuff? Right. I mean, it's like very, very classic. And I became really, really depressed. And then, oh no, what happened?
You're fine.
Oh, okay. It like went away.
Oh, we're still
My
here.
Zoom went away. Can you guys still see me?
Uh-huh.
Oh my gosh, my screen just like went blank. I apologize. Okay, well, I'm just going to keep talking,
You're
and then I'm going to
fine.
worry about my screen later.
Okay.
Hold on. I'm so sorry, everybody. Here you are, Kim. I see you again. Okay. I don't know what happened. My screen just went away. Anyway, so I was a senior in high school, and things were really bad, and I was really, really depressed, and I was like suicidal. And then I would get drunk and I would think, I can't believe I wanted to kill myself 4 hours ago. That's so stupid, and that's really my story. And so my large group of party friends really dwindled down to literally nobody. I was failing out of school. I never ever went to school. And so I didn't lose a lot of things that other people may lose as far as consequences, because I never gained those things to lose them. I had maybe a couple little jobs, but I would just quit them. I worked at like some bagel shops and stuff like that. And I never had a car because my mom told me like, you can drink and do drugs or you can get your license. And I said, sounds good. And then we never talked about it ever again. And I was a kid and I lived at home with my parents. So it wasn't like I was losing my house or anything. But eventually I decided, I feel really dependent. Felt very physically dependent. And I felt like I didn't like that. I didn't want to be physically dependent and be ill if I didn't have this substance. So we found a place that would treat me. I needed a medical detox. And as we talked about, detox can be dangerous. And there were very few places that would detox a minor. I wasn't 18. And so I wound up at the Karen Foundation. If anybody on here has heard of the Karen Foundation, like they're a world-renowned treatment program near Reading. And so once I got there, I think the greatest thing about them is that they really took care of the whole family. And I feel like I was like, once I got there, I was like, okay, like just kidding. Like it's not that bad. I do not have alcoholism. Like I just needed a detox. Like was really like not into it. And they were saying really terrible things. Like you can't hang out with your friends anymore. Like I even had any, but I was like really upset about that. And they told me I had to break up with my boyfriend, which was not happening because I loved him. And, anyway, all these things, but they really took care of my family, and they spent a lot of time working with my family because my family, they're sick too, right? Alcoholism is a family disease. And I really, really believe that. And I had my parents like wrapped around my finger and they were co-signing all my bullshit. Sorry for my language, but like, my mom was excusing me from school every day. Like it was not healthy. And so anyway, I started attending 12-step meetings. I started attending Alcoholics Anonymous, if we're just going to be honest. And I got sober there. And I celebrated 23 years of continuous sobriety this March, and which is crazy that I was able to maintain my sobriety. But there was a few things that I have learned along the way. One is that I felt like when I really look back at my drinking, I can see how like soul sucking it was, how it took me away from everyone that I loved and cared about. Now, I could not see that when I was drinking. I 100% would have said, "You're crazy. I'm right here. What are you talking about?" But I really couldn't. Father Bill, I don't know if any of you guys know Father Bill. Father Bill was a pastor at the Karen Foundation, and he was in recovery too. And he used to say that, oh my God, what was I just thinking? Because he had a few key phrases, but he would talk about how it it prevents you. This is what he would say. It prevents you, alcoholism prevents you from having intimate and lasting relationships. And that's exactly what was happening to me. I couldn't connect with anybody really deeply from my heart because my heart and my brain were like totally clogged with drugs and alcohol. And that made a very lonely existence. And what I gained in recovery was the exact opposite of that. What I gained in recovery was really valuable intimate and lasting relationships with my family. And now I grew up in recovery, right? So now I'm like 18 and I go to college, and I do whatever 20-year-old stuff where I'm like, dating boys in halfway houses and, all this fun things and playing cards at diners. But I was sober. I was 100% sober. And I feel like I have a lot to say about women and alcohol and alcoholism in general too, because, okay, so I grow up, I go to school, I get a great job, I go to graduate school, I become a physician assistant, which I'm still practicing. I worked emergency medicine for almost 14 years and have recently taken a job in cardiology. During that time, I fell in love with another man in recovery who, has alcohol use disorder, who has had a couple of relapses. So I also have been on the family member end of things too. In fact, just really recently, he went through a relapse in January, February. And so I also feel like I have a lot of big feelings and can talk about the trauma of the family member. So that's been like the latest thing that's been personally going on in my life, like kind of dealing with those things and really having an like recognizing and acknowledging that like I have trauma from his relapse, and I love him and care about him, and he's sober again, thank God. And we're working, we're working everything out. But so that's kind of been, I guess, my general background. When I think about my professional life too, I just have to take note when we think about alcohol specifically. I worked emergency medicine for 14 years, right? So I've seen the gamut of drug and alcohol related problems. And I'll tell you what, alcoholism is like the saddest thing ever. Chronic alcoholism and alcohol abuse is just absolutely heartbreaking. And I have seen more alcohol related problems in emergency medicine than I have seen from any other drug. I mean, we get the opiate overdoses and they either live or they die. And we, hopefully, they do okay. But the consequences from chronic alcoholism, I mean, you wouldn't believe, from malnutrition to heart failure to acute liver failure to pancreatitis. I've seen all of that. I've seen people fall down and break their hips. I've seen 30-year-old men come in with like their broken glasses half off their face and big black eyes. I watched a 32-year-old woman hemorrhage to death onto the floor from chronic alcoholism, 32 years old. And I mean, she had a GI bleed and she, so I feel like I've had a lot of exposure to that. And I just feel like there's so much that Kim said that I just really relate to. Hold on, there's a door. I'll be out in a minute, Ellie. It's my 7-year-old that I'm so grateful that I get to be here for her and be sober and be present for her. That's like the greatest gift of them all ever. And forgive me, I kind of lost my train of thought, but I was thinking about, in work and being exposed to all these things and to see the heartbreak, and the families and everything. Oh, I was thinking about like women and alcohol and this social stigma. Like I feel that alcohol is toxic and there's no safe amount. Like I just think it's a toxic substance and it's poison and it harms our bodies physically and mentally and spiritually. Like, it's just not a good substance, but because it's so socially acceptable, people feel that they can go out and do it, and they can. And I would never judge anybody for that. I remain abstinent really for myself, and I don't judge other people who drink, but I just feel like because it's so socially acceptable, it's viewed as being so okay, when the truth is, I think it's a really, really dangerous substance. I think it's a really dangerous substance. I've had people who I admitted to the ICU and alcohol withdrawal, were actively seizing, you know what I mean? I just feel like I have a lot of big feelings about that. And so those were sort of some of the things that I was thinking about. And I feel like I'm a little scatterbrained today, and I'm sorry about that. When I think about the consequences I see, even from a cardiac standpoint, I work in cardiology now, and I see people with chronic heart failure related to chronic alcohol abuse. And I see people with arrhythmias all the time, AFib, highly associated with alcohol abuse. So I just think that alcohol is a really tough thing. And it is tough. And I want to say, this is another thing I was thinking about when we looked at the like mommy juice or whatever it was, like, I'm 23 years sober, and I still feel like weird when I go into social situations and have to say, no, I'm not drinking, and I've been sober my entire adult life. Now I do it because I'm a person in recovery and I don't drink, but it's still that weird vibe. You don't want people to think you're weird. You don't want people to think you're a wet blanket. You don't want people to think you're no fun. And here's the truth. I'm a ball of fun. And I love going out, and I'm a very social person, but it does carry that social stigma. Now, I am pleased that I do see kind of on social media that there's lots of other people that seem to be not drinking as much just because they don't like the way it makes them feel. It gives them a headache. Maybe they feel hungover. So I do think it is becoming more socially acceptable to not drink. And I don't even offer an explanation now. I just say, no, I'm not drinking, I'm having my Diet Coke, big night. I joke, oh, big night, having a Diet Coke, so that's kind of how I handle that situation. And I don't know if, Kim, I should address any of the questions, or if you want to kind of turf them personally, but that's kind of my general story of recovery, that I feel like, I'm in recovery from my own alcoholism. I'm also in recovery from other people's alcoholism. I think alcoholism absolutely affects everyone in the family. I don't think there's any way to escape that. I think that getting help, and help, as you guys said, and you're the professionals, looks like a bunch of different things. There's lots of different resources and ways to do that. But I'm really, and I used to hate it when people would go to AA meetings and say, I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic. But I do feel like I am a grateful recovering alcoholic. I think that me being in recovery and working on myself and trying to be the best version of myself allows me to be present for my kids. I have this awful fear that if I were to drink, that I would be on the other side of a locked door and my children wouldn't be able to get to me, because I wouldn't be opening that door, or I might be blue, and they wouldn't be able to get to me. And that keeps it really real, because even, it'd be really easy for me to say, well, maybe I had a problem when I was in high school, like maybe that was just a phase, whatever. But when I really think about like how I drank and what happened to me when I drank, like when I started drinking, I could not stop drinking. Like once it was in my system, and I didn't drink every day, but once it was in my system, like I was doing whatever I needed to do. I was walking over anybody I needed to walk over, and the consequences for me could have gotten a whole lot worse. And I'm grateful that they didn't have to go. They say you hit bottom when you stop digging, but I feel like that's kind of what happened to me. So I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful that you asked me to share, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. So thanks, Kim. And thanks, Karen. And Judy too.
Really
Thanks,
beautiful.
Sarah.
That was great, Sarah. Thank you so much. And we do want you to chime in on the questions. But I first want to, you said a couple of things that made me realize I want to mention a couple. I'm going to share my screen one more time. Let's do it this way. Okay. So here's that follow-up page. And the reason I want to show you this is this is what Judy put in the chat, conversation.zone/alcohol. So the follow-up page, like you scroll down here, and that's where you'll find the recording of this program when it's ready. This is where my slide deck is. And Karen just told me that she would be happy to send her slide deck. So I'll include her deck as well. But what I wanted to point out is these are some of the resources. And if you click on this first one, the very first thing listed here, I totally geek out on this guy, Andrew Huberman. He runs the Huberman Lab out of Stanford, I think he is. But he did such a great job with this podcast that he has what alcohol does to your body, brain, and health. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's terrific. Here is that DSM criteria handout, that checklist that I was talking about, right? But then and then there's more on women and alcohol, reading, all kinds of stuff is in here. And here's that news story that I was telling you about, how the health benefits have come into question now. Okay, so I wanted you to know about that, but also not that. If you are the parent, grandparent, guardian of somebody with any kind of substance use challenges, we have these support group meetings, much like Al-Anon or Nar-Anon, which we wholeheartedly recommend as well. But these parent partnership meetings, some of them we're meeting in person. Like all these purple buttons are in-person meetings. The green ones are on Zoom, but you can click on these and get like the details about it, where it is, if there's a Zoom link, all that kind of stuff. So we have 2 meetings a week now, specifically for parents of adolescents, parents of teens. So I wanted you to know about parent partnership. And then I finally want to tell you about our family recovery course, which is a 3-part course for, again, parents, grandparents, guardians, caregivers, who are sure that their loved one, it's not a prevention thing. This is our loved one has a substance use disorder. So you can find, there are 2 coming up in May that are on Zoom. We're going to be loading more. We have more dates coming up in June and July that we'll put in here, but for now we're registering for these 2 dates. So I just wanted to point out those resources, and Judy's going to put the links in the chat, or she probably already did, but yes, thank you, Judy. So I see that we're going to get to our advanced questions too, but I want to go to the one that was just asked a little while ago, which is a great question. What is the difference between substance use or abuse and dependency? So, Karen, do you want to take this? I'm not sure if we're talking about dependency, we're talking about tolerance or dependency versus that moderation and creeping into substance use. So what is the difference between substance abuse and dependency? Or is there a difference?
So we typically think of dependency as someone who has a physical dependence on alcohol, but there's also a psychological dependency component as well. So I think we have to consider that. But, when somebody, again, that line of demarcation between abuse and dependency is not always clear. It becomes clear when somebody develops that physiological dependency, where they need a detox to do it safely and to come off of the substance. So that's, short answer for that. Sarah, you could probably chime in on this too.
Yeah, I think that Karen, you're the professional, but I definitely think exactly what you said, that dependency is kind of the not being able to, the physical dependency, not being able to stop. But even you can have a psychological component of making you not being able to stop, this. And it talked about, Kim had it up on her first slide, like continuing to drink, even if you've had negative, consequences or outcomes, even if you know that it's not necessarily the best thing for you, and you continue to do it anyway. Which I was reading all those slides and I was like, yes, I have that. Yes.
And you can kind of think too about the fact that even once somebody has abstained and they found some sobriety, some sober time, is the stinking thinking, as they say, is that still happening? So that's kind of more the psychological dependence on it. Would that be accurate to say? Like, so you're not actually, there's not the tolerance is gone, the use is gone, but the need, the craving, like where does craving fall into all of that?
Typically in earlier recovery, most people at some point in their recovery, the cravings go away. But in early recovery, when they're closer to the active use, the craving cycle is more active. But then people also have cravings at different, when people have associations where they do things where they used to drink, or certain mood states or feeling states are develop craving cycles as well, or but cravings are, what do we say in Digital? We say that the average craving lasts 19 minutes. So if you think about it, sometimes they're really short. It's just like a passing thought. And then most of the time when people have a really active craving, they're already at the liquor store buying booze. Right. So, and sometimes people don't realize they're craving until they're going to buy alcohol.
And it occurs to me too now that I'll have naltrexone in this slide deck, which I really should, because when we're talking about MAT. So Karen, have you worked with clients who have been using naltrexone or other medications to help with those cravings?
Yes, and you did actually have naltrexone.
Did I have it in there?
You did.
I don't think I said it out loud. I was just like, sorry.
Yeah, you had it with Campril and the other and
Antabuse, yeah.
Yeah. So naltrexone has been really helpful for people. Surprisingly, I wasn't sure it would be helpful for alcohol, but it really is. People have had great results with it.
Wonderful. I spoke with Cal Campman one time. He's the guy down at Penn that does a lot with addiction medicine with that. And he says that he has one patient he was working with who had been in recovery for a few years at this point. She'd used naltrexone early on in her recovery, and then she had some time that she didn't feel she needed it any longer. But then she had her sister's wedding coming up, and she knew like that's a big trigger for her for whatever reason. For her particularly, that was a big trigger. So he's like, so we'll get you on it for a month, or two, or however you feel like this will be like a little security for you, and it worked beautifully. So I think that's a really can be a really helpful tool for folks. And I think along those same lines of looking at the ways that someone crosses into, this progression, there was an advanced question. What steps can you take when you recognize that you've crossed the line or getting close? So where, and is it something you said, Karen, that people often it's the family member who sees it before the individual. So maybe if you can look at it both ways, like as an individual who and you both have self-disclosed yourselves being in recovery. When did you know that you got there, that this is a problem? I really need to stop. I should stop, whatever that felt, whatever that sounded like to you, versus how the family member can see the need for an intervention or change.
Well, Karen's story might be a little different than mine. I knew that I had a problem when I celebrated a year of sobriety. Like it took me that long. Like I got a year and I was like, maybe they were right. maybe I had a really life-threatening, addiction to drugs and alcohol. So that was my personal story. I really liked how you guys had kind of a lot of different options in finding kind of recovery. I think that if an individual person is kind of dabbling with this, like, I don't know, do I have a problem? Do I not have a problem? I mean, now I go to Alcoholics Anonymous. They wrote this book, Alcoholics Anonymous, in 1935, published in 1939. And even in that book, which is almost 100 years old, they tell you, if you think you have a problem with alcohol, try to stop drinking, try to stop or moderate, see if you can do it. And if you can't do it, then you might have a problem. And now there's a lot more resources, like you mentioned, the apps and stuff, and Sober Curious. But those would be my suggestions. If you think you have a problem, try to stop or moderate in some capacity and see if you can tolerate. You see if that works for you, if you can do that. My problem, and one of the characteristics of my alcoholism, is that if I was enjoying my drinking, I wasn't controlling it. And if I was controlling it, I wasn't enjoying it. Like for me, having 2 drinks would be torture. Like I couldn't do that because I wasn't getting what I was seeking in the alcohol. And at the same time, if I wasn't trying to hold back, I was totally off the rails. Even for that night, I'm not saying necessarily every day, but I definitely, would get drunk. So, that's kind of my feeling. And Karen, I want to hear what you have to say, but.
Yeah, I mean, some of the same things that you said, Sarah. If you think you have a problem, you can take the questionnaires that are designed to help you tease out, am I an alcoholic, based on how you answer the questions. But, don't even worry about the word alcoholic. That's what I would say first. I would say, get honest with yourself about what your pattern of drinking is, and ask yourself, has it increased over my lifetime? And why is my pattern of drinking bothering me at this time? And really have an honest conversation with yourself. And then if you want to go see, you could, go see an outpatient therapist and get some support that way. You can also go to local community organizations like AA or Sober Cure, do an app, start to track what your drinking is like throughout the week, and again, be honest about it. Just like we have to get honest about our consumption of food, or sugar, try not to look at it differently. The problem with alcohol, though, when you're consuming too much alcohol, is that it impairs your ability to really be honest with yourself, because your thinking is impaired. So, that's where it gets a little tricky. So going to see someone, if you're having a hard time with it, might be a good idea. Other ideas, Kim?
Well, I was just going to say that leads into the other question I was going to ask.
The second part.
Well, and then the number one question that came in ahead of time was how to encourage a friend or family member to seek help when they don't think that they have a drinking problem.
Right. So that's a tough one. And, and again, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's like, how do you get honest with someone and have a really tough conversation? But you have to think about it this way. Because I was talking to somebody today whose partner has advanced liver disease and is actively drinking again. And, really, really, really hard. Because if you're concerned about someone and they're in real physical danger, sometimes you're talked to somebody and try to get honest with them and have a very real conversation, but their thinking is so impaired that they're not really able to take in what you're saying. So if it's a friend that you think is abusing alcohol and you can get them sober, get them earlier in the day, have the conversation. Maybe if there are other people who are also concerned, maybe just have a meal and sit and have a conversation, and maybe have everyone have a conversation about what their thoughts are about, their consumption of alcohol, right? Because we don't want to single somebody out, but if we can all have a conversation about it, it's so much easier. But I think you just have to get real and get honest and use I statements and not judge. And I do think people respond to that. Like the situation you talked about, Kim, with your dad and the therapist you had gone to, a great example.
Yep.
I think that too, that I'll just piggyback on that, which you guys have already talked about, but I think that if it's someone who is particularly close to you and their drinking is really bothering you, then I would encourage people to seek help for themselves. So if it's a loved one, there's Al-Anon, there's Alateen for young people. If you're a teenager, and that was kind of one of the other questions, what to do if it's your mother who is drinking and you're a teenager, I think that, trying to make sure that you have adequate support. There's Alateen is available online, which can offer some good resources. I don't, because every situation I think is a little different. So it's hard to give like a blanket kind of statement. I definitely, obviously the I statements I think are really impactful and important, but I think making sure you have support for your own self. So my husband relapsed after 9 years of sobriety. And so he went away to treatment and I got a therapist, you know what I mean? And he went away to treatment and I went to family support groups because it's not just his alcoholism. Like it's alcoholism.
Absolutely.
That's how I feel like it is. It's like the disease of alcoholism came into my house. Like it wasn't just like his drinking. It was like this darkness that like came into our house and tried to like kill both of us for a little bit. And so to expect him to be the one that's just going to, you have to do all these things. I feel like I really am seeing like, wow, I was really affected by that. And it's so true too. Like I was very much on that end of it where he was drunk and I was very much sober. And so I'm witnessing these really painful, really upsetting things, and really painful and really upsetting things were said. And I remember every single one of them. And he has this like hazy kind of, so I think it's really important. Here's another visitor. I think it's really important that I have learned to seek help. The other thing I want to say is that he actually went through a relapse 9 years before. Ellie, this is not a good time. Sorry. So, and when he got sober that time, it's okay, Maribel can stay, the dog's here. But anyway, when he got sober that time, I feel like my attitude was a little different. My attitude at the time was like, we were both in recovery, and I was like, all right, you got to do what you got to do. You're either going to do it or you're not, And so I feel like this time I'm looking at it very differently, that like, I've really been affected by this. He's been affected by this. We were both injured by this darkness that came into our house, and we're both going to try to get help for it.
And I also just said, since we brought up my dad, I should say, so he's 91 and he got sober when he was 66. So he's got 27 years of recovery. So it is possible, by the way, just on that note about the family. And I was going to adult children of alcoholics meeting. So that's another 12-step group that is for the family members, and ACA, or, they're now called adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families. So I'm like, show me the family that doesn't need that meeting. I'm sure there's some functional family out there somewhere, but I'm pretty sure anybody could benefit from those ACA meetings. And
to put another plug in, I just want to put another plug in for, family members getting help, or the person who is concerned about somebody who has a problem. Because here's the thing, if we want our loved ones to get help, we need to be working on ourselves. And the chances of that person staying sober, if they do get sober, go up tremendously if everybody is educated on how the family has been impacted by the disease. And really, from personal, you have to treat your own problems.
Here, very true. I'm glad, Sarah, that you reminded us about the question about a young person whose mom is misusing alcohol. So I appreciate that. Yes, Alateen for sure. If they're open to it, it can be a challenge to get to Alateen if you don't have an adult who's able to take you. But that is such a good resource. Sure.
I was actually looking them up online too, because they have like
are they online?
Yeah, because I was looking it up in reference to that question, and they do have like an online presence, There's also, it's so tough for, teenagers, because you're almost an adult, but you're not quite there. And because of course, doing therapy, and there's lots of therapists that are working over Zoom now, so you don't necessarily need, and lots of therapists who take insurance and stuff like that. So, just trying to get your help and, take care of your own heart. It's very painful, because we can't make anybody do anything. Can't make anybody do anything. And that's, I think, the most painful part of alcoholism, and how it affects the family. It's very scary. It can be really, really scary, because you think, why can't, how are you even doing this? It doesn't make any sense. Why would you cause all this harm? But the truth is, it's just alcoholism, when it's crossed into that, is just this incredibly powerful force that is stronger than, this is what I think, and it's stronger than me, and it's stronger than my honey, who I adore. And when he was relapsing and drinking, I knew that it wasn't his heart. This was not his heart doing this, that's why I said it just felt like alcoholism came back into my house, and so it can be really scary. And I empathize a lot with those that are, feel kind of stuck in that situation. But there are lots of resources. And the other thing is, I think it's a lot more common than people realize. There's so much shame, and nobody talks about it. And I think that, like you said, who couldn't go to an ACOA meeting? I feel like, so, people aren't alone. This is really, really common. And so.
Sure. Absolutely. Let's see. I think we might have time for one more question. So I like this. How does alcohol affect some people negatively and not others, especially within the same family that has a history of alcohol use? Karen, love to hear your take on this.
Well, the nature of genetics is that, if it is a genetically inherited problem, it's not going to show up in everybody. And the tricky thing with alcoholism is we don't always know who is going to have the problem and who's not. And we don't know that person is going to, start having a problem until they take a drink. And Sarah, you talked a lot about your family history. So, I mean, you said something about not wanting to be that
Mhm.
person either, and probably never intended to
Mhm.
develop a problem. And, it's tricky because we can have a sense and that it runs in families, but if I had, an answer to this question for everybody, then I'd, win the lottery or something,
Yeah,
because if
be
I could
very
predict
rich.
it, I guess geneticists are going to be able to do that more accurately as time goes on, but we're not quite there yet.
So totally. And I have to say, this is something I think about a lot. I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I'm an alcoholic, married to an alcoholic, right? So these kids really have the cards stacked against them. But I will say that studies show that children who are raised in homes in recovery have, if they do struggle, their periods of use are statistically shorter and their rates of recovery are much higher. So Karen said, we can't necessarily predict who's going to respond one way or even have an understanding as to why. Like, here's the thing, like, I don't know, like my parents divorced, but like that, and that's my trauma or whatever. But like my parents love me very much. I felt safe and protected in my home. I went to a private school. Like I had all the opportunity in the world. Like, and I still became an alcoholic. You know what I mean? Like, I do think there's something genetically weird in my brain that when I was exposed to alcohol for whatever reasons, my brain was like, okay, and that's just kind of my personal feeling about myself. And so I am fearful that the same phenomenon will happen with my children, but I do think that taking care of myself, working on myself, taking care of myself, living in recovery, being present for them. My hope is that that if they do struggle, that, they'll find their way to recovery. And then it has to be a lot of trust in the plan, the universe's plan for us and our family, that we'll face whatever we need to face whenever it comes along. But I don't have an exact, like, there's no answer as to why some people respond in one way and some don't, and there are people who have suffered horrific trauma in their life who don't end up slugging alcohol, so,
Right.
Absolutely. Really good point. Yep. And I know that somebody had also asked, what are the best ways to stop this trend from reproducing itself in our female youth? And I'll just say, if either of you have any comments about that, I would love to hear them. But I will say that on that follow-up page, we have a recording of a previous program from earlier this month about underage drinking, and it's called Alcohol a Rite of Passage, ? Which does not have to be, but there's some like really good tips for like modeling, like by not pouring a glass of wine and saying like, what a crappy day I had. So, that kind of thing, like just that this is not the solution for life's challenges, like let's not model that. Let's talk about the healthy ways that we can use to cope with stress and anxiety. Getting outside. You want to come with me for a walk? Let's go play some backgammon because I need to chill out, instead of always, turning to this as like the feel good. But any thoughts about that? Karen?
Connection and relationships, and having fun and modeling fun, and that it doesn't always have to include alcohol, that alcohol is in its appropriate place if there is drinking in the family. And thinking about if you have problems, you deal with them, and you just seek out help when you need it. And this is just one problem that people have, but the way that we stop the problems in families is by dealing with our own.
Right.
And Sarah, your example of that, having gotten sober younger, right? Like being able to, recognize you had a problem sooner in your life, and then going to get help for it.
Yeah. And I think that it's also nice. We have dance parties in the kitchen, and I'm like a total goofball. And so I think that, that alcohol is not a part of our life, but, it's tough. I think that there is still a lot of peer pressure, and, I hope to teach my kids. One, I just feel like alcohol is so unsafe, especially for women, right? Young women. Oh, it makes me so nervous. I'm more of afraid of my kids going to like a frat party than, you know what I mean? Like, so I don't know. I feel like I'll have to cross that bridge when I get to it. But I think that this idea that it makes you impaired and you lose control of decisions, I want to teach my son, teach my son like that there needs to be consent. If somebody is intoxicated, they cannot give consent, like really, like, so I think about this stuff a lot. but yeah, so I think that we'll do our best. And I think there is a movement, to not, like, there are people that are not drinking, that are not alcoholics. They're just not drinking because it makes them feel like crap,
Right.
and they're sick of it. And,
Yeah.
it's not how they want to spend, their time. And so I'm excited about that type of movement, and my kids see me act like a goof and have fun, and I don't need alcohol as a social lubricant. And so I'm hoping to model those things to them too.
Beautiful. Wow. This was so great. This time flew. It really did. I so appreciate you guys being here. Wow. Women just are amazing, aren't we? And I'm looking at
Women
the
are amazing.
participants. It looks like it's late here. I'm loving this. This is so cool. Karen and Sarah and Judy, thank you for such a good conversation. This was a great evening. Thanks for being with us, everybody. And the recording will be up in the morning. Please take the survey when this ends. And again, thank you to Karen and Sarah so much.
Yes. Thank you, Kim.
Thank
It's good to see you. Good to see you, Karen. Thanks, Judy.
Good night.